Hello, my friends. Whether you're in Eretz Yisrael and you're reading just Parshas Balak, or whether you're in the diaspora reading both Parshiot Chukas and Balak, allow me to share with you something about the blessings that Bilam gave to the Jewish people. King Balak made 3 attempts to get the Gentile prophet Bilam to curse the Jewish people. We know the story, of course. Each effort resulted in blessings instead of curses. What's curious is that while there were 3 attempts to curse the Jewish people, the first 2 attempts, the Torah states that God placed words in Bilam's mouth. In other words, Bilam was completely helpless. Vayasem davar befiv, God inserted the words into Bilam's mouth. But when it comes to the 3rd attempt to curse the Jewish people, the Torah doesn't say that God put words in Bilam's mouth. It seems that by that time, Bilam came to his own realization after the first 2 attempts, you can't fight City Hall, and he could no longer manipulate Hashem's will. He therefore chose a different strategy, and as the Torah states, he saw that he could no longer use divination, and therefore, Vayashet el hamidbar panav, he turned his face towards the wilderness where the Jewish people were encamped, and he provided them with a series of blessings without God placing words in his mouth. Now, these blessings are a bit ambiguous in what they actually mean, but the Talmud in Tractate Sanhedrin interprets the words of Bilam and says that Bilam actually, in this 3rd iteration, gave the Jewish people 10 distinct blessings. The first of those 10 distinct blessings were the words, Matovu ohalecha Yaakov, how goodly are thy tents, O Jacob. And the Talmud says that this refers to Bilam blessing the Jewish people to have synagogues, shuls, and batei midrash, and places to study Torah. And the next blessing, the Talmud says, was the blessing of Mishkanotecha Yisrael. May the divine presence always dwell within you. And then he goes on, may your sovereignty continue forever. May you have olive orchards and vineyards. May you always have a good name, a good reputation. May you produce kings of great stature. May you have dynastical monarchies. May your kingdom dominate other kingdoms. May your kingdom be fierce and aggressively strong. And may your kingdom instill fear in others. The Talmud then states that because Bilam initiated these blessings on his own, all of those 10 blessings eventually reverted back to curse. All of them eventually meant disaster and downfall for the Jewish people, all except the first blessing. The blessing of Matovu ohalecha Yaakov, how goodly are thy tents, how goodly are thy synagogues and study halls, was never reverted into a curse. Now, why is that? Talmud doesn't explain why. Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz of Prague of the 18th century understands that Bilam's thoughts were to curse the Jewish people, and therefore, even though his words were blessing, his malicious intent eventually crept into his words, and therefore all of them were meant as curses instead of blessings, which were eventually realized. But Bilam never had malicious intent when he wished for the Jewish people to have strong synagogues and study halls. Why? Rabbi Yonasan Eibeshitz gives 2 reasons. Number 1, it's because even the Gentile world recognizes the value of Jewish prayer and Jewish Torah study, because perhaps on a subconscious level, there's a recognition that the Jewish people bring value to the entire world, not just to themselves, when they pray to God and they enrich the world with Torah study. So he genuinely wanted the Jewish people to have synagogues and to have study halls. Second reason that he gives is whereas having an abundance of wealth, having orchards and vineyards and monarchy and strong kings and dynastical kings, all of those things instill the Jewish people with pride and ego and a sense of confidence. Having synagogues, having a Beit HaKnesset where you go to pray, instills you with humility. And if his desire was to suppress the power of the Jewish people, to suppress their mighty ability to dominate the entire region and the entire civilized world of the time, perhaps his desire for them to have strong synagogues and study halls was a genuine desire to suppress that sense of strength and confidence, because when Jews come into shul, they stand before God with great humility, realizing that we are helpless without you, Hashem, and we turn our eyes heavenwards towards you. That was the image of the Jew that Bilam was only too happy to bless the Jewish people to have. Reb Eibeshitz uses this in his Sefer Ya'arot Devash as a launching pad to express his displeasure with how some of the shuls of his time in the 18th century have not realized that objective of humility. Instead of the shul being a place where Jews humble themselves, sometimes the shul has become a place where Jews seek to garner honor for themselves by making very, very public displays of donations and ostentatious celebrations, and he felt that we need to go back to the synagogue that Bilam was referring to. But I'd like to offer and suggest one more thought as to why perhaps the blessing of synagogues and study halls was never reverted to a curse. As a preface to the 10 blessings, we mentioned that the Torah states that Bilam turned his face towards the wilderness, Vayashet el hamidbar panav. Perhaps what he was doing was offering blessings that inherently contain curse. His thinking was, I can't overtly curse the Jewish people, so let me at least offer them blessings that actually contain the seeds of their own destruction. And when it says, Vayashet el hamidbar panav, he made his words like a wilderness, like fallow soil, that just like fallow soil can sometimes be used to cultivate great things, and you can produce orchards and grow vineyards and have tremendous wealth as a result of a wilderness if you cultivate it properly, but you can also allow a wilderness to turn into weeds and thistles and thorns. And therefore his words were fallow, awaiting them to either turn into a blessing or a curse. And therefore he blessed them. May the divine presence rest upon you. Is that a blessing? Of course, but only when the Jewish people are behaving correctly. If the Jewish people sin, then having the divine presence with them is only going to accelerate their great retribution and suffering. Having beautiful orchards and vineyards, great blessing. What could be the downside? Well, wait until the locusts come. Wait until you suffer great financial devastation as a result of all of the possessions and all of the real estate that you have. Having a strong monarchy is great until it attracts the ire and the jealousy of other nations who wish to topple you. And so essentially what Bilam was offering to the Jewish people was blessings that contained within them the very seeds of their own destruction, in his hope that, yes, I realize there is a glorious future for the Jewish people, but may that glorious future also portend great destruction for the Jewish people. However, the one thing that Bilam made a mistake about was his thinking that synagogues and study halls could in themselves bring a potential downfall for the Jewish people. As long as the shul or Beit Midrash is open, this ensures the opportunity for prayer and Torah study. Unlike the other blessings of wealth and bounty in this world, there is no downside in those endeavors. Bilam perhaps thought that with the erection of Jewish communal structures, Jews would eventually abuse their communal structures, they would get into fights, and this would create dissent and disharmony within Jewish community. But the opposite has proven to be true. It's true that we're not perfect in our institutions, but by and large, whenever we build a shul or a Beit Midrash, we use it primarily for constructive purposes. And that's why our sages state that when the Messiah comes, all synagogues in the diaspora will be transported magically to Eretz Yisrael. These structures contain the best aspects of the Jewish people and therefore deserve to take their rightful place in the perfected community of the Messianic promised land. And yet, we find ourselves in our current state. We find ourselves at this stage without shuls and study halls as we slowly emerge from the pandemic. How can that be? If the Talmud states that Bate Knesiot to Bate Midrashot, our shuls and study halls, is an eternal blessing that can never be turned into a curse, that can never be taken away from us, How can it be that during this pandemic we have been deprived of our Jewish institutional structures? What this Talmudic passage proves to us is that our current plight is a temporary blip, an anomaly in the long historical pattern of the Jewish people. There have been other pandemics in our history, and there have been other temporary closures of our religious institutions. But in the long run, our shuls and batei midrash will always remain open. There are many lessons to draw from this temporary closure, and we've mentioned so many of them in the past several weeks. Certainly, Rav Eibeshitz's concern that our places of Torah study and prayer should instill us with humility is a sobering thought, and as we slowly come back to our beloved shul, I note that our prayers, behind masks and at a proper social distance, contain a newfound sobriety and reverence. Certainly, absence makes the heart grow fonder, and people have learned from this pandemic not to take our shuls for granted. But let's also remember that Jewish community can never be a bad thing. As much as some of us have enjoyed certain aspects of our isolation, and as much as sometimes we get annoyed at certain aspects of Jewish community, we all yearn to return to our communal infrastructures in order for us to continue as a strong people and to retain our spiritual lifeblood. And our blessing is that our cautious return to our shuls continue with good health, under responsible, proper measures of safety and caution. And may we see the day when our shul, together with all the others in the diaspora, returns with us to Eretz Yisrael. B'meira b'yameinu amen. I wish you a beautiful Shabbos. Stay safe, stay healthy, and I hope to see you in shul.